The memory of a man is often a fragile thing, a collection of stories we tell ourselves to find meaning in the quiet moments before the world wakes. We find that the past is never truly behind us. It is a shadow that stretches across the threshold of the present, waiting for the light to shift just enough to reveal its shape. Tonight, we travel to the humid, rolling landscape of Georgia in the late 1920s, a place where the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine and the distant, rhythmic pulse of a city trying to find its footing in a changing world. It is here, amidst the flickering street lights and the cooling asphalt of Atlanta, that we find a man named John McDaniel. At 49 years of age, John was a man of steady habits and a long-standing commitment to the streets he patrolled. He had been a member of the Atlanta Police Department for 17 years, a span of time that had etched the geography of the city into his very bones. He was a husband, a neighbor, and a familiar face to those who walked the beat alongside him, carrying with him the quiet authority of a man who had seen the sun rise and set over the same corners for nearly 2 decades. The evening of August 19th, 1928, began with a sort of mundane predictability that usually defines a long career in law enforcement. There was the familiar weight of the uniform, the tactile click of the belt, and the low hum of the city settling into its evening rhythm. We can imagine the soft glow of lamps in parlor windows and the distant sound of a radio playing through an open door as Officer McDaniel responded to a call regarding a disturbance between 2 acquaintances. It was a common enough occurrence, the kind of friction that arises when tempers flare in the summer heat. But as he arrived at the scene, the atmosphere shifted. Among the voices was a man named Frederick Fair, the primary instigator of the conflict. When McDaniel stepped forward to perform the duty he had performed thousands of times before, to place Fair under arrest and restore the peace, the sequence of the night broke. A shot rang out, sharp and sudden, tearing through the evening air and striking the veteran officer in the chest. The aftermath of such a moment is often characterized by a strange, ringing silence. We see the arrival of the ambulance, the frantic energy of the hospital staff, and the 3 long days that followed as John McDaniel fought to remain in a world he had served so faithfully. But by the 3rd day, the wound proved too great, and the city lost a man who had been one of its pillars. For Frederick Fair, the act of violence set in motion a legal odyssey that would span decades and cross state lines, a journey defined by escapes, aliases, and the persistent illusion of a new life. After his initial apprehension, Fair was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, a finality that seemed certain until the Georgia Supreme Court intervened, overturning the conviction and ordering a new trial. Yet, the scales of justice tipped the same way once more. A second trial resulted in a second conviction and a second death sentence. In the depths of the Fulton County Jail, as the summer of 1930 reached its peak, Fair sat in a cell, a condemned man waiting for an end that felt inevitable. But on August 21st, the heavy iron doors were compromised. Alongside another prisoner also facing the ultimate penalty, Fair vanished into the night, leaving behind the stone walls of his confinement for the uncertain freedom of the road. For 6 years, the name Frederick Fair disappeared from the ledgers of Georgia. He moved westward, shedding his identity like a worn-out coat, eventually settling in the town of Enid, Oklahoma. It was here that he built a life out of thin air. Adopting the name Roy C. Wallace, he found work. He walked the streets of Enid as a law-abiding citizen, and he even married, sharing a home and a life with a woman who knew nothing of the shadow that followed him from the east. The life of Roy Wallace was one of carefully constructed normalcy. We can picture him in the quiet moments of a Sunday afternoon, perhaps tending to a small patch of grass or sharing a meal with his wife, the Mrs. Wallace, who would later describe him to the world. To the neighbors in Enid, he was a kind man, a generous soul who seemed no different from any other laborer trying to make his way through the Great Depression. However, the veneer of peace was occasionally pierced by what his wife described as outbursts of uncontrollable temper. These were the only cracks in the mask, the only hints that beneath the surface of the helpful neighbor lived a man who had once pulled a trigger in an Atlanta street. By the time his past finally caught up with him in August of 1936, the marriage had ended in divorce. But the fingerprints he left behind in Oklahoma were what ultimately betrayed him. An Enid police officer, performing the diligent, repetitive work of identification, matched the prints of Roy Wallace to those of the fugitive Frederick Fair. When he was returned to Georgia, the threat of the gallows loomed once again. But the passage of time and the complexities of the legal system offered a reprieve. On October 14, 1936, Governor Herman E. Talmadge commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. It was a measure of mercy that Fair seemed unable to accept as a final destination. Less than 2 years later, while stationed at a prison work camp in Chattooga County, he saw another opening. On May 22, 1938, he slipped away from the work details, disappearing into the woods and beginning a 2-week flight that led him back to the familiar territory of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But this time, the homecoming was short-lived. Upon his recapture, a darker layer of his double life was unearthed. Authorities discovered that during his years as Roy Wallace, just before his first capture in 1936, he had been responsible for the attempted murder of a man and his wife in Hennessy, Oklahoma. The illusion of the kind and generous neighbor was further eroded by the evidence of a violent streak that knew no borders. In August of 1938, Fair faced a different kind of reckoning in an Oklahoma courtroom, receiving 2 concurrent 10-year sentences for his crimes in Hennessy, before being returned once more to the custody of Georgia. The records of his time in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary remain thin, a ghost in the machine of mid-century bureaucracy. But the arc of his life eventually curved back to the place where it all began. Frederick Fair, the man of many names and many escapes, lived out the remainder of his years in the state where Officer John McDaniel had once patrolled. He died in Atlanta in March of 1963, a quiet end to a life defined by turbulence and the desperate attempt to outrun the consequences of a single, violent night. As we look back at these events, we see the ripple effect of a moment's loss. Officer McDaniel was survived by his wife, a woman who had to navigate 35 years of widowhood, while the man responsible for her husband's death cycled through prisons and aliases. We find ourselves reflecting on the nature of change and the persistence of the truth. While Fair sought to bury his past in the dust of Oklahoma, The past remained a tether, pulling him back until the cycle finally closed. The streets of Atlanta have changed since 1928, the flickering lamps replaced by the steady glow of modern life. But the story of the officer and the fugitive remains a part of the city's quiet history. We can rest now, knowing that the discord of those years has faded into the stillness of the archive. The night is long and the air is cool, and the shadows that once chased Frederick Fair have finally found their rest. There is no more running to be done, no more names to borrow. The stories are told, the ledgers are closed, and the world remains in a state of deep, undisturbed peace. Would you like me to continue with the account of George Darnell and the tragedy at Henrietta? We turn our attention now to the thick, humid air of the American South in the year 1930. The midnight hour has settled over the landscape, bringing with it the heavy and rhythmic chirping of cicadas. Their song acts as a natural metronome, a steady pulsing sound that invites your breathing to slow and your mind to drift. In the darkness of a Georgia summer, the heat of the day lingers in the soil, but the world has gone still. It is in this profound quiet that we consider the concept of the split man. This is an individual who attempts the impossible task of dividing his soul in two. He is a person who might spend an entire decade living as a saint, performing acts of kindness and building a reputation of quiet dignity, all in a desperate effort to bury a single minute of past sin. We see this duality in the artifacts left behind. Imagine an old fountain pen resting on a desk, its nib leaking a dark pool of ink onto a yellowed map. The stain spreads slowly, seeping into the fibers of the paper just as a fugitive's past eventually bleeds into his present. The boundaries between who he was and who he has become begin to blur, and the ink eventually finds every corner of the map. As we settle deeper into this history, we begin to feel the physical weight of the 1930s. It was a decade defined by the tactile and the immediate. There is a sharp contrast in the textures of this era that tells the story of Frederick Fair better than any ledger could. On one hand, there is the cold, serrated edge of a 1928 Georgia prison key. It is heavy, forged from unforgiving iron, and it represents the rigid finality of the law. On the other hand, there is the soft, warm dust of white flour on a baker's hands in a small town in Oklahoma. This flour represents the mundane peace of a new life, the quiet labor of a man trying to provide for a family and disappear into the fabric of a community. This transition was part of what many at the time called the geographic cure. It was the prevailing belief that a man could outrun his very soul simply by crossing a state line. In the 30s, a man's identity was only as heavy as the paper it was printed on, and as fragile as the memory of a stranger. Without the digital tethers of the modern world, one could simply step off a train in a new territory and become someone else entirely. Roy C. Wallace was the name Frederick Fair chose to wear in Enid, Oklahoma. To his neighbors, he was a man of outbursts and temper, yes, but also a man capable of great kindness and generosity. He married, he worked, and he waited. He believed that the miles between Georgia and Oklahoma acted as a shield, a vast expanse of plains and dust that could swallow a murder conviction. But the silence of the night eventually speaks, and the weight of that iron key remains, waiting to be turned. Every kindness offered in his new life was a stone placed on a scale, hoping to outweigh the heavy lead of a chest wound suffered by a patrolman years prior. We find ourselves watching the ink spread across the map, waiting for the moment the stain reaches the town of Enid. Would you like me to go into more detail regarding the specific day Frederick Fair's double life was finally dismantled by the Enid police? The fingerprints of a man can be a quiet map of his past, etched into the very skin of his reaching hands. In the summer of 1936, the humid air of Enid, Oklahoma, seemed to hold its breath as an officer of the law looked down at a set of ink-stained cards. For 6 years, the man the community knew as Roy C. Wallace had lived a life of quiet industry and domestic routine. He had married, he had worked, and he had successfully buried the ghost of Frederick Fair beneath the red soil of the plains. To his neighbors, he was a man of occasionally sharp edges, a victim of what his wife called outbursts of uncontrollable temper. But to the state of Georgia, he was a condemned murderer who had vanished from the Fulton County Jail in the dark of August 1930. The dismantling of this second life began not with a grand confrontation, but with a steady, rhythmic verification of identity. Fingerprints do not lie, even when the tongue has spent years perfecting a new name. When the Enid police finally matched the ridges and whorls of Roy Wallace to the wanted posters of Frederick Fair, the transition from citizen to fugitive was instantaneous. His wife, now the ex-wife of a man she realized she never truly knew, spoke of him with a complicated grace. She noted that while his temper was a wild, untethered thing, there were long stretches where he was as kind and generous as any man could be. It was as if two men occupied the same suit of clothes, one a provider and the other a predator, waiting for a moment of heat to switch places. By October 1936, the geography of his life shifted once more as he was extradited back to the humid confines of Georgia. There, in a turn of political mercy, Governor Herman Talmadge commuted his death sentence to life in prison. For a moment, it seemed the story might find its conclusion in the gray stillness of a cell block. But the spirit of Frederick Fair was not suited for the sedentary life of a lifer. Within 2 years, the iron gates failed to hold him. On May 22, 1938, he slipped away from a prison work camp in Chattooga County, disappearing into the thick brush of the Georgia woods. He ran west, drawn back to the familiar horizons of Oklahoma like a moth to a distant flame. He was captured in Tulsa only 2 weeks later. But the man who emerged from the shadows was far more dangerous than the one who had fled the Fulton County Jail years earlier. As Oklahoma officials prepared to hand him back to Georgia, a darker layer of his hidden years was unearthed. They discovered that just before his first capture in 1936, Fair had attempted to murder a man and his wife in the small town of Hennessy. The weight of his crimes had doubled. In August 1938, he was handed 2 concurrent 10-year sentences in the Oklahoma penitentiary, a temporary detour before he would eventually return to Georgia to face the final chapters of a life spent in a perpetual state of escape. He would eventually find his way back to Atlanta, the city where the disturbance first began, only to pass away in the spring of 1963. A man who had lived a dozen lives, yet died with only one name. Would you like me to examine the documents regarding the Hennessy attack and how he managed to evade local suspicion for so long? The record of that final spring in 1963 provides a quiet bookend to a life defined by its loud, jagged edges. Yet to understand the man who died in Atlanta, we must travel back 35 years to the heavy, stagnant air of an August afternoon in 1928. The city of Atlanta was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of streetcar tracks. A place where the humidity didn't just hang. It pressed against the skin like a damp wool blanket. It was Sunday, August 19th, a day when the typical rhythms of the city slowed to a crawl. The silence of the residential streets broken only by the occasional drone of a passing Model T or the distant tolling of a church bell. For Patrolman John McDaniel, a 17-year veteran of the force, the day likely felt like any other in a career defined by the steady, patient work of keeping the peace. We see him now, a 49-year-old man whose presence was as much a part of the neighborhood as the brickwork of the storefronts. He moved with a measured gait of someone who had walked these beats 1,000 times before. The weight of his navy blue wool uniform was a familiar burden, the fabric chafing slightly at the neck as the afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith. In his pockets, the small, mundane items of a working man's life. A pocket watch, a notebook, perhaps a sprig of mint or a bit of tobacco, clinked softly with every step. There is a specific kind of bravery in the routine, a quiet acceptance of the risks that lurk behind every closed door. And on this day, that door belonged to a house where a domestic disturbance was boiling over into something far more volatile. The call had come in as a dispute between acquaintances, the kind of friction that often ignites when heat and tempers collide in cramped quarters. As McDaniel approached the residence, the air seemed to thicken further with the smell of street-level exhaust and the sweet, rotting scent of overripe peaches from a nearby vendor's cart. He was walking toward Frederick Fair, though at that moment, Fair was just another name on a report. A man whose uncontrollable temper was about to collide with the rigid authority of the law. McDaniel's boots crunched on the grit of the pavement, a sound that would later be remembered as the final heartbeat of a peaceful afternoon. The confrontation was brief, a sudden rupture in the Sunday stillness. As McDaniels attempted to place Fair under arrest, the air was shattered by the sharp, stinging report of a pistol. The flash of the muzzle was a momentary tear in the fabric of the day. A single bullet found its mark in the patrolman's chest, a devastating impact that sent him reeling back into the dust. The world narrowed down to the sound of his own labored breathing, and the sight of the Atlanta sky, pale and indifferent above the rooftops. What followed was a 3-day twilight, a period of suspended animation where the entire city seemed to hold its breath. McDaniel was rushed to the hospital, his life measured out in the rhythmic beep of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses in the hallway. Outside, the newspapers carried updates that were read with a somber, hushed intensity in barbershops and on front porches. There was a collective hope that the veteran lawman would pull through, that the strength he had shown for 17 years would be enough to ward off the shadows. But the wound was deep, and the infection of the era was a relentless foe. In the quiet hours of the night, while his wife sat by his side and the city slept in uneasy fits, John McDaniel's strength finally ebbed away. He passed into the history of the department on August 22nd, leaving behind a grieving widow and a city that was suddenly, sharply aware of the darkness that lived among them. The man who had taken his life was no longer a mere disturber of the peace. He was a fugitive from a justice that was already beginning to tighten its grip. Unaware that this was only the first chapter in a saga of escapes and double lives that would span the American continent. Would you like me to describe the specific layout of the Fulton County Jail as it stood in 1930? Or shall we move directly to the night Frederick Fair managed to slip through its iron gates? The transition from a free man to a condemned soul is rarely a sudden fall, but rather a slow, agonizing descent through the gears of the Southern legal machine. Following the death of Officer McDaniel, Frederick Fair found himself entombed within the thick, humid stone of the Fulton County Jail, a structure that seemed designed to swallow the very concept of time. The year 1929 bled into 1930 as the Georgia Supreme Court weighed his life in the balance, initially offering a glimmer of hope by overturning his first conviction. Yet, that hope was a cruel mirage. A second trial yielded the same grim harvest. A second conviction and a second sentence of death. To live under a single shadow of the gallows is a weight few can comprehend. But to hear the black-robed judge pronounce that same finality twice creates a unique kind of psychological limbo. In the silence of his cell, Fair was no longer a man with a future, but a ghost waiting for a formal invitation to depart. The Fulton County Jail of that era was a place of sensory deprivation and haunted mechanical life. As the city of Atlanta slept, the building itself seemed to breathe, its aging radiator pipes singing with a high-pitched metallic whine that cut through the stagnant air. This constant rhythmic clanging became the heartbeat of the condemned row, a sound that masked the more clandestine vibrations of the human voice. It was against this backdrop of whistling steam and clinking iron that Fair began to whisper across the void to another man, whose days were numbered, a fellow prisoner also facing the ultimate penalty. In the specific acoustics of the cell block, sound traveled in strange, curved paths, allowing two men to plot their resurrection while the guards paced the distant, echoing corridors. They spoke of the world beyond the bars, not as a memory, but as a destination that required only one perfect moment of mechanical failure or human oversight. The pressure of the impending execution date acted as a catalyst, stripping away the fear of the unknown and replacing it with a cold, calculated desperation. By the late summer of 1930, the legal avenues had narrowed to a point of suffocation, and the two men realized that the only way to survive the law was to step outside of it entirely. They watched the patterns of the moon, the shifting shadows of the watchmen, and the way the heavy Georgia fog would occasionally roll in to hug the prison walls, turning the world into a landscape of gray ghosts. The plan was not born of impulse, but of 1,000 shared whispers during the hours when the singing pipes were at their loudest. On the night of August 21st, 1930, the atmospheric conditions and the human spirit aligned in a way that defied the prison's formidable reputation. While the details of the mechanical breach remain a matter of historical shadow, the result was a definitive fracture in the state's grip. Fair and his companion navigated the labyrinth of the interior, moving with the practiced silence of men who had already rehearsed their escape 1,000,000 times in the theater of their minds. When the final iron gate yielded, the transition was jarringly quiet. There were no sirens in that first breath of liberty. Only the heavy, damp scent of the midnight air and the thick veil of the Georgia fog waiting to receive them. As Frederick Fair stepped into the mist, he did more than just leave the confines of Fulton County. He shed his identity like a discarded garment. The man who had pulled the trigger in Atlanta vanished into the white expanse, leaving behind a name that would haunt the police files for years, while a new, quiet shadow began the long journey westward toward a life that no one expected him to lead. Would you like me to detail the specific route Fair took during those first few days on the run? Or shall we move forward to his arrival in Oklahoma and the birth of Roy C. Wallace? The dusty plains of Enid, Oklahoma, offered a specific kind of anonymity in the early 1930s, a place where the wind scrubbed the horizon clean, and a man's past could be buried as deeply as the roots of the winter wheat. It was here, nearly 800 miles from the blood-stained pavement of Atlanta, that Frederick Fair ceased to exist, replaced by a man named Roy C. Wallace. To the neighbors on his quiet residential street, Roy was the picture of hard-working, Great Depression-era domesticity. A man who preferred the steady rhythm of a paycheck to the chaotic adrenaline of the criminal underworld. We find him in a world of picket fences and Saturday evening socials, a far cry from the iron bars of the Fulton County Jail. Life as Roy Wallace was built on a foundation of meticulously curated kindness. He was the man who would help a neighbor patch a leaking roof or share a bit of tobacco over a garden fence. This was the illusion of redemption, a secondary skin grown over the scarred identity of a cop killer. In the small, sun-bleached house he shared with the woman who would become his wife. The air often smelled of slow-simmering Sunday pot roast and the sharp, clean scent of starch from freshly pressed shirts. To Mrs. Wallace, he was a provider, a man who seemed to have appeared from the ether with no family to speak of and no stories of his youth, yet possessed a gravity that commanded respect. They spent their evenings on the front porch, the steady, rhythmic creak of the wooden swing serving as the heartbeat of their shared life. However, the ghost of Frederick Fair was never truly exorcised. It merely waited in the shadows of Roy's mind. While he played the part of the gentle husband, those who looked closely noticed the cracks in the mask. There were moments when the kind and generous Roy would vanish, replaced by a cold, vibrating stillness. His wife would later recount that his only real trouble was a series of outbursts of uncontrollable temper, flashes of a dark, predatory energy that seemed entirely disconnected from the man who enjoyed gardening. A dropped plate or a misunderstood question could trigger a transformation where his eyes would turn flat and distant, reflecting a violence that had no place in a quiet Oklahoma town. These were the terrifying flashes where the fugitive peeked through the domestic veil, reminding the world, and perhaps himself, that he was a man living a lie. For 6 years, the masquerade held firm. Roy Wallace worked, he paid his taxes, and he walked the streets of Enid with the confidence of a man who believed he had outrun his own shadow. He curated a reputation for reliability, becoming a fixture in the community's peripheral vision. He was the good neighbor who never spoke of Georgia, never mentioned the name John McDaniel, and never looked too closely at the wanted posters that occasionally fluttered in the post office breeze. He had created a sanctuary out of thin air, proving how easily a man can reinvent himself if he is willing to discard his soul in the process. Yet, the peace of Enid was a fragile thing, held together by the silence of a man who slept with one eye open. Even as he sat at the dinner table, the clink of silverware against porcelain often felt like the rattling of chains he had left behind. The kindness he showed was real in its practice, but hollow in its purpose. It was a shield, a way to ensure that if the law ever came knocking, 100 voices would rise up to say that Roy Wallace was a good man. According to the later reports, he was remarkably successful in this endeavor, nearly convincing himself that Frederick Fair was a dream he had once had in another lifetime. But as the year 1936 approached, the weight of those 6 years began to press down. The temper flares grew more frequent, the mask thinner. He had built a life on the plains, married a woman who believed in his goodness, and established a sanctuary of mundane comfort. He did not know that the very fingerprints he used to cash his paychecks and sign his marriage license were silent witnesses, waiting for a single moment of scrutiny to betray the man hidden beneath the name of Wallace. The illusion was nearly complete, but the past was a patient hunter, and the quiet streets of Enid were about to become the stage for a reckoning that had been 6 years in the making. Would you like to explore the specific events that led the Enid police to finally take an interest in the quiet life of Roy Wallace? Or shall we move directly to the moment his fingerprints unraveled the 6-year lie? The summer heat of 1936 hung heavy over Enid, Oklahoma, a thick, stagnant blanket that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of its inhabitants. It was August 6th, a day that began with the mundane rhythms of a working-class household. Yet it carried an invisible weight, the gravitational pull of a past that had finally caught up to the present. Roy C. Wallace, a man known for his quiet demeanor and his role as a husband, walked into the local police station not as a predator, but as a man snagged by the mechanical teeth of a bureaucracy he could no longer outrun. The investigation had been quiet, a slow gathering of whispers and suspicions that had eventually crystallized into a formal request for identification. There is a specific, clinical coldness to a police precinct in the middle of a sweltering afternoon. The ceiling fans churn the humid air without cooling it, and the smell of stale tobacco and floor wax creates an atmosphere of weary permanence. As Roy was led toward the fingerprinting station, the world began to narrow. The expansive life he had built, the marriage, the job, the reputation of a kind and generous neighbor, started to pull inward, collapsing toward the tips of his own fingers. The officer in charge did not look at Roy as a man, but as a series of biological data points. The process was methodical and rhythmic. First came the glass slab, smeared with a thin, glistening layer of black printer's ink. Then, the firm grip of the officer's hand on Roy's wrist, a tactile reminder that he was no longer in control of his own movements. One by one, his fingers were pressed into the dark grime. The ink felt cool and slick, an alien substance that filled the microscopic valleys of his skin, tracing the ridges that nature had carved into him at birth. These patterns were the only things he hadn't been able to change when he shed the name Frederick Fair. He had changed his clothes, his city, his wife, and his very way of speaking. But the silent geometry of his fingertips remained an immutable witness to his history. As each finger was rolled from nail edge to nail edge onto the white card, the identity death began in earnest. With every black smudge left on the paper, the character of Roy Wallace grew paler, more transparent. To the police, the emerging loops and whirls were a map leading back to a chest wound in an Atlanta officer and a daring escape from the Fulton County Jail 6 years prior. To the woman standing in the periphery of this unfolding drama, the woman who called herself Mrs. Wallace, the sight was transformative in the most agonizing way possible. She watched from a distance, her hands likely clasped tight, witnessing a metamorphosis that defied logic. She had known a man who struggled with a fierce, uncontrollable temper. Yes, but she had also known a man who could be incredibly soft-hearted. In her mind, he was Roy, a man of simple needs and occasional shadows. But as the officers compared those fresh ink marks to the grainy record sent from Georgia, she saw that man dissolve. The kind Roy was being replaced by a ghost named Frederick, a convicted murderer who had been marked for the gallows long before they had ever met. It was the ultimate betrayal of the senses. The person she had shared a bed with was a fabrication, a protective shell grown over a core of violence. The room remained quiet, save for the scratching of a pen and the distant drone of the Oklahoma cicadas outside. When the confirmation finally came, it wasn't a shout or a dramatic revelation, but a simple nod from an officer. The science of the ridgeline had spoken, bridge linking the peaceful streets of Enid to the blood-stained history of Georgia. Frederick Fair was no longer a fugitive. He was once again a prisoner of his own skin. As the sun began its slow descent over the Oklahoma plains, casting long, distorted shadows across the station floor, the transition was complete. The man once thought to be a permanent fixture of the community was now a cargo to be returned to the state that still held a death warrant in his name. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a vacuum where a life used to be. With the mask of Roy Wallace finally shattered, the authorities began the grim task of preparing for his return to the South. But the road back to Georgia would hold its own set of twists. Would you like to hear about the legal maneuvers that spared him from the noose upon his return? Or shall we move forward to his final, desperate flight from the Chattooga County work camp? The transition from a death sentence to a life of hard labor is a strange sort of mercy, one that weighs heavily on the spirit as the years begin to stretch into an indefinite horizon. By the spring of 1938, Frederick Fair had become a fixture of the Georgia penal system, a man whose identity was defined not by a name, but by the rhythmic clink of a sledgehammer against stone. We find ourselves now in the rugged landscape of Chattooga County, where the red clay of northern Georgia clings to everything it touches, staining the hem of a man's trousers and the very pores of his skin. The work camp was a place of sun-bleached wood and barbed wire, where the days were measured in the heat of the afternoon and the exhaustion that settled into the marrow of one's bones by dusk. The air in the camp was often thick with the smell of pine resin and the acrid tang of wood smoke from the mess hall. For Fair, the labor was a grueling physical reality that demanded his total attention, a cycle of lifting, swinging, and breaking. that left little room for the grand illusions of his former life in Oklahoma. The limestone quarries and the roadbeds required a steady, unrelenting pace, and the guards watched from the shade of the trees, their rifles resting across their knees with a casual, terrifying indifference. It was a world of sharp edges and heavy burdens, where the only constant was the sound of the hammers, a steady, heartbeat-like thud that echoed off the hillsides. As the month of May warmed the valley, a familiar restlessness began to take root in Fair's mind, a sensation that many who have spent years in confinement describe as an addiction to flight. It is a psychological state where the act of running becomes more important than the destination itself. He was no longer a man seeking a home or a quiet life under a false name. He had become a creature of the escape. On May 22, 1938, that addiction finally overbore the weight of his chains. Using the cover of the dense Georgia brush and a momentary lapse in the perimeter's vigilance, Fair vanished into the tree line, leaving behind the red clay and the dust of Chattooga. The flight that followed was not a sprint, but a desperate cross-country trek fueled by the instinct of a hunted animal. He moved through the shadows of the deep South, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the law was most likely to wait. According to the reports that would later surface, he made his way toward the familiar terrain of the Midwest, drawn back to the plains of Oklahoma like a moth to a distant, flickering light. He reached Tulsa within 2 weeks, a feat of endurance that spoke to the sheer desperation of a man who knew the inside of a Georgia death cell all too well. In Tulsa, the city hummed with the energy of the oil boom's aftermath, a sprawling urban landscape where a man could easily lose himself among the boarding houses and the industrial districts. But the victory of reaching Oklahoma was hollow. Fair found himself wandering the streets of a city he once knew, realizing with a sinking clarity that he was simply running away from a shadow that moved at his own pace. The fear was no longer behind him. It was within him, a permanent passenger in his mind. The end of this particular journey came quickly. On June 5th, less than 14 days after his disappearance from the work camp, the Tulsa police spotted a man whose nervous gait and weathered appearance didn't quite fit the Sunday morning calm. When they closed in, the man who had once been Roy Wallace offered little resistance. It was as if the exhaustion of the road had finally caught up with the spirit of the fugitive. As he sat in a cold cell in Tulsa, awaiting the inevitable journey back to the Georgia authorities, a new and darker revelation began to emerge from the files of the Oklahoma investigators. A shadow from his past in Hennessy that would ensure he remained behind bars for a very long time. Would you like to explore the specific details of the crimes in Hennessy that were uncovered during his capture? Or shall we move forward to the arrival of the man who would become his most persistent shadow, George Darnell? The revelation of the crimes in Hennessy provided a grim symmetry to the life of Frederick Fair. Yet, as the dust settled on his capture in Tulsa, another name began to circulate through the telegraph wires of the Midwest, a name that would eventually stand as a chilling parallel to Fair's own flight from justice. While Fair's journey was defined by an impulsive burst of violence followed by years of hiding, the story of George Darnell was born from a much slower, more calculated form of malice. It is often said that while anger is a fire that consumes the self, spite is a cold tool used with precision to dismantle the lives of others. In the late summer of 1929, the air in the mining town of Henrietta, Oklahoma, was thick with the scent of coal dust and the humid weight of a coming storm, a stillness that mirrored the quiet, simmering resentment of a man who felt the world had finally pushed him too far. George Darnell was a man of the rails, a section hand who understood the mechanical language of the iron road. He knew the tension of the bolts, the weight of the steel, and the absolute vulnerability of a train when its path is even slightly altered. On August 17th, 1929, that intimate knowledge turned into a weapon of revenge. Darnell had been dismissed from his job that morning, a termination he laid squarely at the feet of his foreman. In the quiet logic of a broken mind, he decided that a ruined career deserved a ruined reputation, and he believed a derailed freight train would be the perfect instrument to ensure his foreman was never trusted with a section of track again. There is a mechanical coldness to sabotage. It requires a steady hand and a heavy wrench. We can almost hear the rhythmic, metallic clank of the tool against the rail in the darkness, a sound muffled by the surrounding woods, as Darnell worked to tamper with a critical track switch just outside of town. He did not intend to kill, or so he would later claim. But the physics of the railroad do not account for intent. As Darnell retreated into the shadows to watch the fruit of his labor, it was not a slow-moving freight train that approached the bend. Instead, the 1:30 a.m. passenger train, a heavy iron beast filled with sleeping souls, came thundering through the Oklahoma night. The transition from the steady, rhythmic clicking of wheels on a healthy track to the catastrophic scream of twisting metal is a sound that defies description. When the engine hit the tampered switch, the inertia of thousands of tons of steel met the immovable earth. The silence of the woods was shattered by the arrival of a tragedy that would claim 13 lives. 11 of them passengers who had been dreaming of their destinations only moments before. While Frederick Fair ran across state lines to save his own life, George Darnell began a different kind of flight, one fueled by the knowledge that he had ruined 13 others for the sake of a petty grudge. He remained in Henrietta for a time, walking the same streets as the grieving families, perhaps even smelling the smoke that lingered at the wreck site. But as railroad detectives began to piece together the deliberate nature of the accident, the net began to tighten. Darnell vanished, beginning a 2-year odyssey of evasion that would eventually lead investigators to the quiet town of Parsons, Kansas. On April 5th, 1931, the man who had turned a wrench into a scythe was finally brought to ground. When the detectives finally sat him down and placed the photographs of the mangled steel and the draped forms of the victims before him, the coldness finally thawed into a pathetic, desperate regret. He broke down and wept, the weight of the 13 ghosts finally proving heavier than any railroad tie. He pleaded guilty almost immediately, trading a potential date with the executioner for a life behind bars. The years would pass in the gray monotony of prison, and though he sought parole in 1947, the memory of that August night remained as vivid as the scars on the Oklahoma landscape. The railroad employees, the men who knew the sacred trust of the tracks, appeared at his hearing to ensure that the man who had betrayed the iron road would never walk free again. As we look back at the images of Darnell from 1951, we see a face etched with the realization that some mistakes cannot be mended with a wrench, and some journeys end long before the train reaches the station. Would you like to hear more about the specific legal battles that kept Darnell behind bars during his final years? Or shall we move forward to the moment he finally faced the families of those he had lost? The weight of a secret is a physical thing, a phantom passenger that sits upon the shoulders and grows heavier with every passing mile of the journey. For George Darnell, the 2 years following that sweltering August afternoon in 1929 were not lived in the pursuit of freedom, but in a slow, agonizing surrender to the gravity of his own choices. He had moved north, drifting across state lines like the very coal smoke from the engines he once serviced, eventually finding a precarious sort of anonymity near the rail yards of Parsons, Kansas. By the time the calendar turned to April 5th, 1931, the man who had once been fueled by the sharp, acidic burn of industrial spite had been hollowed out, replaced by a shell that seemed to vibrate with the frequency of a coming storm. The capture itself lacked the cinematic thunder one might expect for a man responsible for 13 deaths. There was no high-speed chase, no exchange of gunfire in the tall grass of the Kansas plains. Instead, when the railroad detectives finally closed the distance, they found a man who looked less like a saboteur and more like a ghost seeking a place to haunt. Darnell did not fight the handcuffs. He seemed to welcome the cold bite of the steel against his wrists, as if the physical constraint of the law was the only thing capable of steadying his trembling frame. He was a man who had exhausted the horizon. In the quiet of the transport car, as the rhythm of the tracks clicking beneath them mocked his every thought, Darnell sat in a slumped, rhythmic trance. Some men run to escape the law. George Darnell ran to escape the sound of his own ears. When they brought him back to Oklahoma, the atmosphere in the interrogation room was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the clinical, unyielding light of a single electric bulb. The detectives were prepared for a hardened criminal, a man who would lie and pivot to protect his life. What they encountered instead was the wickedy, weeping fugitive, a man whose tear ducts seemed to be the only part of him still capable of vigorous action. Darnell began to spill his story before the first formal question was even finished, his voice a ragged whisper that broke against the silence of the room. He spoke of the day he was fired, the petty sting of being cast aside by the railroad foreman, and the catastrophic simplicity of his plan. He had only wanted to cause a delay, he claimed. He had only intended to derail a freight train, a mess of wood and steel that would cost the foreman his job and restore a sense of balance to Darnell's bruised ego. The turning point of the confession came when the lead investigator reached into a manila folder and spread a series of black and white photographs across the wooden table. These were not images of twisted metal or spilled cargo. They were the visceral, unvarnished records of the human cost at Henrietta. The camera had captured the jagged remains of the passenger cars, the scattered belongings of families who had been dreaming of their destination, and the grim work of the recovery teams. Darnell leaned forward, his eyes widening as they raked over the evidence of his handiwork. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. He didn't turn away. Instead, he gripped the edges of the table until his knuckles turned a porcelain white, his chest heaving with dry, racking sobs that sounded like the grinding of gears. He described the internal geometry of his guilt, explaining to the court and the officers that the moment he heard the news of the 11 passengers dying, the world had lost its color. He had remained in Henrietta for a time, walking the very streets where the funeral processions had passed, unable to tear himself away from the epicenter of the tragedy he had authored. Every whistle of a passing locomotive in the years that followed had felt like a personal accusation, a high-pitched scream tailored specifically for his conscience. As he signed his confession, the pen shaking in his hand, there was a sense that Darnell was not just pleading guilty to a crime, but was attempting to perform an exorcism on his own soul. The life sentence that followed felt less like a punishment and more like a sanctuary, a place where the walls were thick enough to muffle the ghosts, even if they could never truly silence them. As we consider the image of this broken man, we are forced to wonder if the bars of a cell are ever as restrictive as the memories we carry within us. Would you like to delve deeper into the specific testimonies of the survivors who confronted Darnell during his sentencing? Or shall we turn our gaze toward a different kind of darkness embodied by the man known as the Tyrant of Prague? We turn our gaze now toward the frost-bitten fields of Prague, Nebraska, where the winter of 1925 refused to relinquish its hold on the black soil. In this corner of the world, the silence of the plains is not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, physical presence that settles over the lonely farmsteads like a shroud. It was here, amidst the creaking windmills and the rhythmic thrum of the harvest cycles, that a different kind of darkness took root. Not the darkness of a predator from the outside, but the claustrophobic rot of a home turned into a fortress of fear. The man at the center of this grim landscape was John Smetak, a patriarch whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about in the safety of distant kitchens, yet never challenged at his own gate. He was a man who ruled his patch of earth with an iron hand and a bitter heart, driving his children into the cold and his wives into the shadows of despair. The geography of the Smetak farm was defined by a singular, looming feature: a deep, stone-lined water well that pierced the Nebraska earth. This well was the lifeblood of the property, providing the water that sustained the livestock and the family. Yet it would eventually become a tomb. In March of 1925, the air was still sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the ground remained stubborn and unyielding. It was during this month that John Smetak simply vanished from the surface of the earth. To the casual observer, the farm continued its slow, mechanical existence. Smoke still drifted from the chimney, and the remaining son, 21-year-old Adolph Smetak, continued the grueling labor of the spring planting. When neighbors finally worked up the courage to ask after the elder Smetak, Adolph offered a simple, calming explanation. He told them his father had finally followed a long-held desire to return to the old country, traveling back to Bohemia to visit relatives and seek the peace that had eluded him in the New World. For months, this story held. The community of Prague lived in a state of complicit silence, a collective holding of breath. There was no great outcry for the missing tyrant. In truth, the neighborhood seemed to exhale in his absence. The domestic fugitive does not always flee across state lines or hide in the crowded tenements of a distant city. Sometimes, the fugitive hides his crime in the very ground he farms, staying exactly where he is, banking on the idea that no one will care enough to look for a man who was hated while he breathed. Adolph Smetak did not run. He stayed in the house where he had been beaten, walked the halls that still echoed with his father's rages, and looked at the mouth of that well every single day. He moved with a retrospective calm, convinced that the damp, claustrophobic stone of the well would keep his secret as effectively as any ocean. By August, however, the heavy heat of the Nebraska summer began to pull at the edges of the deception. Suspicion, once a quiet murmur, became a formal inquiry. County deputies arrived at the property, their boots crunching on the dry earth as they moved toward the well. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ripening grain and the metallic tang of old machinery. When they lowered their lanterns into the darkness of the shaft, they found what the community had perhaps known in its heart all along. John Smetak had never left for Bohemia. He was found at the bottom of the well, his body preserved by the cold, subterranean water and the heavy silence of the stone. Adolph's confession came not with a shout, but with the weary resignation of a man who had been carrying a crushing weight for too long. He described a final, violent confrontation, one of hundreds that had defined his life. In the heat of a physical struggle, Adolph had reached for a hammer, striking his father down to end the cycle of tyranny once and for all. He then admitted to taking over $1,000 in cash and forging his father's name on certificates of deposit worth thousands more, perhaps viewing the money as a late payment for a lifetime of suffering. The subsequent legal proceedings pulled back the veil on the Gothic rural reality of the Smetak household. Former teachers and local bankers stood before the board to testify, not for the victim, but for the killer. They spoke of a man who was a brute and a pervert, a father who had driven his children away and broken the spirits of his wives. There was a haunting suggestion from Adolph's brothers, Frank and Anton, that their mother had not died of natural causes, but had been poisoned by the patriarch. They spoke of a second wife driven to an asylum by his hand. This was the dark heritage Adolph had inherited, a legacy of blood and stone. Though he was initially sentenced to life, the community's shared memory of the tyrant's cruelty eventually led to his release in 1940. Adolph returned to the very same county, married a woman named Marie, and lived out his days in the shadow of the events of 1925. A man who found his only peace in the soil that had once held his darkest secret. As the sun sets over the quiet fields of Nebraska, leaving the Smetak farm to the wind and the memories of the well, we travel now toward the sun-drenched coast of California, where a different kind of criminal was making his escape not into the earth, but across the rolling waves of the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean has a way of swallowing secrets, its vast blue horizon offering a promise of infinite distance that the dusty, landlocked plains of Oklahoma could never provide. While men like Frederick Fair were digging into the red clay to hide their tracks, Lloyd Sampsell was looking toward the whitecaps of the California coast, envisioning a life where the law could not follow because it simply could not keep pace. To the authorities of the 1920s, a getaway car was a predictable challenge, but a luxury yacht was a phantom. Samsel was not your average desperate hold-up man. He was a creature of refinement and calculation. A man who believed that if one must live outside the law, one should do so with a certain level of aesthetic grace. Along with his partner, Ethan McNabb, Samsel operated under a philosophy of the glamorous decay. They didn't retreat to squalid hideouts or damp basements after a score. Instead, they retreated to the Sovereign, a magnificent vessel that served as both their sanctuary and their transport. We can almost hear the rhythmic lap of salt water against the hull, a sound so vastly different from the dry whistle of the wind through an Oklahoma cornstalk. On the deck of the Sovereign, the air smelled of salt and expensive tobacco, and the only indicator of their profession was the heavy weight of stolen currency stowed beneath the polished wood of the cabin floor. They would dock in port cities from Vancouver down to Los Angeles, stepping off the gangplank in well-tailored suits, looking more like successful venture capitalists than the yacht bandits the papers would eventually name them. They would strike a bank, like the $17,000 robbery in Berkeley. And before the sirens had even faded into the city noise, they were back at sea, the coastline shrinking into a thin, gray line. There is a profound irony in the clinking of ice against a crystal glass in the galley of a stolen yacht. A sound of absolute leisure that would, decades later, be replaced by the clinical, rhythmic hiss of cyanide pellets dropping into a vat of acid. By 1929, the sea finally ran out of room for Samsel. He was captured in San Francisco and sent to Folsom Prison. But even behind stone walls, his persona as the intellectual fugitive flourished. He didn't break rocks. He broke systems of influence. He was a man of high intelligence who understood the psychology of power, eventually ingratiating himself with the prison administration to such a degree that he practically ran the facility from the inside. This influence followed him through the years, most notably during World War II, when he was moved to a less secure prison farm. The corruption of the era allowed him what was known as French leave, a gentleman's agreement where the warden permitted Samsel to spend his weekends at his girlfriend's apartment, provided he checked back in by Monday morning. It was a surreal existence, a life of intermittent freedom that only ended when the press exposed the arrangement, cost the warden his job, and reminded the public that Samsel was still, at his core, a predator. His release in 1947 should have been the start of a quiet twilight. But the adrenaline of the high-stakes life was a ghost he couldn't outrun. Within a year, he was back to the banks. But the world had changed. The 1948 robbery of the Seaboard Finance Company in San Diego lacked the seafaring elegance of his youth. It was a frantic, violent affair. For the first time in his long career, blood was spilled. Samsel shot and killed a bystander named Arthur W. Smith and wounded an officer, a move that instantly placed his name on the FBI's most wanted list. The manhunt was brief but intensive, ending in Phoenix, Arizona, in March of 1949. The man the FBI pulled from the shadows was no longer the dashing captain of the Sovereign. He was tall, gaunt, and weary, a remnant of a bygone era of crime. During his final years on death row at San Quentin, he found a strange kinship with the famous Carol Chessman, using his sharp intellect to draft legal briefs that delayed his end for 3 years. In those final days, Samso reflected on a legacy that was invisible to the police and the public. He spoke with a quiet, tragic pride to a reporter about a son he had kept secret, a young man, 6'3", serving his country overseas, married with children of his own. It was the one thing he had built that wasn't stolen, a life of honor that he could never officially claim as his own for fear of tainting it. On April 25, 1952, the transition from the salt air of his youth to the stagnant air of the gas chamber was completed. The yacht bandit was gone, leaving behind only the cold transcripts of his crimes and the silent, successful life of a son who would never know the full weight of his father's shadow. As the echoes of the heavy iron doors at San Quentin settle into the silence of history, we find that even the most calculated lives eventually reach a final, unchangeable resolution